Okay, well, kia ora and welcome to another episode of Both Sides Now with your hosts, Alex Martin and Eve McCullum. Today, we are really excited to be joined by Otago University Professor Andrew Geddis. Andrew teaches parts of public law courses as well as electives in law and the democratic process, advanced legislation and Bill of Rights, theory and practice. Two of those three papers are definitely on our academic transcripts. And I think it is also reasonably safe to say that he is the leading researcher and commentator on electoral law in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So welcome, Andrew. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Kia ora. It's nice to see both of you again.
Likewise. So we thought this year marks 30 years of our mixed member proportional system being the governing electoral system in New Zealand. Can you give us your best breakdown of MMP?
Sure. So MMP is a way of choosing representatives in Parliament. That's how we choose our MPs. And it's a political party-focused electoral system whereby people get two votes. They get to vote for their local candidate. So you still get to choose your candidate in Dunedin, your candidate in Wellington, candidate in Auckland, wherever you happen to be living. But, and most importantly, you also vote for the political party you most like. And the overall seats in Parliament are then distributed based on the population's choice amongst the various political parties. So all the individual candidates elected out of all of the individual electorates are sent off to Parliament to be MPs. And then extra top-up MPs are given to political parties so that each political party's share of Parliament very closely reflects its overall share of the party vote. So if you get 10% of the party vote, you get 10% of the seats in Parliament. So that means two things. First of all, it's proportionate. So the support of the party determines its number of MPs. And secondly, it's very strongly party focused. So it really is your party vote that is the one that ultimately is determining overall share of Parliament, which ultimately determines government.
This year, we've seen a little bit of a run up for different electorates. Do you think there are any key electorates? You say the party vote is the important one. But do you think this year there are some specific electorates to watch? Could our votes for our electorate MPs and candidates make a bigger difference this year?
Sure. Well, first of all, your vote for your electorate MP matters to you in the sense that you might really care about who is representing your city. So down here in Dunedin, where I am, I really care who my local electorate is, local MP is, and I want them to be the MP I most support because, I want my local person to be the one I like. So we all care about who we elect locally. And of course, the candidates who are running really care, right? All the candidates in Dunedin, they want to get elected. So your electorate vote matters from that perspective, a local perspective. From a national perspective, however, your electorate vote will only matter in one of two situations. One is if you've got a political party that needs to win an electorate to get over the so-called threshold, the criteria that then allows you to bring in extra list MPs, because you either need to get 5% of the party vote, which is a lot of votes. It's about 140,000 votes, which, that's the size of Dunedin. We're that big now. Or alternatively, if you can win an electorate, then you also get to bring extra MPs in. Right. So if you're a party that wants to win an electorate, in order to get extra MPs through the party vote, then an electorate matters. And that used to be the case with Epsom, right? We always said ACT needs to win Epsom so they can get more list MPs. Now, at the minute, it's not looking really like there's any parties are going to rely on that avenue back into Parliament. The existing parties are all well above 5%. They'll get in, through that mechanism. Perhaps the Opportunities Party, which is starting to come up a bit, but frankly, they don't really have an electorate they're strong enough to win. I mean, I know they think they might win Mount Albert, but they're not going to. Labor's going to win that. So that route for the electorate vote actually doesn't really seem to be that important this election. The other way, though, that electorate votes matter is if a party wins more electorates than it should have, given its share of the party vote. And that, of course, is Te Pāti Māori and the Māori seats. So at the minute, Te Pāti Māori has 6 seats in the House. Its party vote should have only given it 4. So that then creates what's called an overhang. Parliament just gets bigger, which is why at the minute we've got more than 120 MPs to account for those extra overhang seats. And of course, the bigger Parliament is, the more MPs you need to get a majority in order to govern. So at the moment, you need 62 MPs to form a government rather than 61. So what that means is in the Māori seats, the contest for those seats might really matter, because if Te Pāti Māori was able to win 5, 6, 7, but only is entitled to 2, 3, 4 from its party vote, that's going to create this overhang, which is going to mean you need more seats to form a government, which could, in a very close election, have an impact. Point being, your electorate vote in the Māori seats really matters. Other electorates this time round, well, they're going to be interesting from a, the North Shore seat, which Act 1, will they get to keep it? That's interesting from a kind of nerd perspective. You guys care, I care. It's interesting from the perspective of local folk wanting to know who their local MP will be, but in terms of overall national effect, probably not so much.
So you mentioned before about this 5% threshold, and I know that you were involved in a review of MMP a couple of years ago, where you looked at sort of, should this threshold change? Why do we pick 5%, and then do you think it should change?
Sure. So we picked 5% because the figure was decided by the MPs who passed the Electoral Act 1993, and those MPs were all from National and Labour, and they were really concerned to basically stop other parties being able to get into Parliament. I mean, that it was set at 5% in order to make sure it's quite difficult for parties to actually get into Parliament. Now, there is a principled reason for that. You don't want it too easy to get into Parliament, otherwise you fracture representation and you end up like Italy or you end up like Israel, and it just becomes very difficult to actually form stable governments. So any threshold is going to be a trade-off between allowing representation while also not so splintering representation that you then make it very difficult to form government. The independent electoral review that you referred to, which I was a part of, we proposed 3.5%, because the history of MMP simply is that it's 5% is just really too big for outside parties to overcome. There's been lots of attempts to do it, but outside of ACT, the only party that's managed it, it's just too difficult to actually get yourself that many votes to get into the House. So we've basically got the same parties kind of retreading around in the last 30 years. I mean, some have come and gone. Peter Dunn was there for a bit, but he never managed to take off, and so on. And I think the Opportunities Party this time around is a good example of that, where there's definitely some interest in them. They're sort of bubbling away there. But frankly, people who are interested in them really have to trade off and ask, look, if you're not going to get to 5% and I vote for you, I've basically wasted my vote. And that makes it very difficult for a new incoming party to actually say to voters, hey, give us a chance, give me your vote. We're likely to get over 3.5% and get in, and then we'll see how we go. And so we thought, we being that independent electoral review, that dropping it down to 3.5% would allow for new entrants to come in. It would allow you to disturb the existing political market, if you want to use economic terms, while not really risking too much destabilization and fracturing. I mean, you're still talking about 100,000 votes to get to 3.5%. And we thought if you can get 100,000 votes across the country, you probably should be allowed MPs in Parliament.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that destabilization and that fracturing. Do you think MMP has encouraged more cooperation or more fragmentation in politics?
I mean, it's probably both would be the answer. Okay. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff I think we need to pull out. Well, first of all, is obviously encourage some element of cooperation, because you have to cooperate to govern, right? And we're seeing this at the moment. I mean, even though ACT, New Zealand First National snipe away at each other, underneath, where they're frantically scrambling to keep government going, I mean, they're having to work together, because you need 62 votes in the House to govern. To get 62 votes, parties have to work together. And if they don't work together, then there is no government. So from that point of view, the sheer requirements of Westminster government require there to be some form of cooperation. The question then about fragmentation, it's a really tricky one, because, I mean, I think New Zealand politics certainly has become more fragmented. And you could say the existence of, a range of parties from, the right of the spectrum to the left of the spectrum to, other sort of valences, sort of encouraged lots of different messaging to go out there, and everyone can sort of see a place for themselves. And so that pulls us all apart, as opposed to back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where you had two flavors of politics, national or Labour, right? You could have any politics you wanted as long as it was red or blue. So MMP's more diverse marketplace, encourages a range of different messages to voters, and so then pulls people in different ways. But you can look at countries that have first passed the post-voting systems, and I'm not sure they're any less fractured than we are here. I mean, the United Kingdom has first passed the post-voting. And the party that's got the greatest amount of support there at the moment is the Reform Party, right? So my point being that the theory is that first past the post encourages people to, support one of two big parties, because only one, whoever gets the most votes wins. Proportional representation pulls people in different directions, because you get multiple forms of representation. Something seems to have happened to politics that means that idea, that truism, seems to have fallen apart. And the existing big parties, the legacy parties, the Tories and Labour, and in the UK, if you go to Canada, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, they don't have that same hold on the masses of voters as they did in the past, and voters are prepared to abandon them and go off to new political vehicles. So has MMP increased fragmentation? Well, fragmentation has increased everywhere. We've had MMP. Has it made it better or worse than it would have been? That strikes me as a very tricky question, because there's just simply so many different things going on, as well as our change in voting system.
You mentioned there first past the post, which is a different electoral system, and obviously it has also caused fragmentation. How much of an impact does a country's electoral system, so the way we elect people, actually have on politics and the makeup of the government and that sort of stuff?
Well, so the idea, let's make it very simple, and we'll just do first past the post and MMP, because there's also then all sorts of other flavors. There's STV, like they use in Ireland. There's additional member, like they use in so lots and lots of different flavors. We'll just do first past the post versus MMP. I mean, the idea of first past the post is it's meant to be a very simple voting system. You just choose who you like most in your electorate. And the benefit it's always promised is that it will give you a one-party majority government that will then be able to govern for a period of time till the next election. And so that the idea is always that one party will win the majority of seats and be able to run the country. That seems to have fallen down a bit again with this breakdown of voting patterns and people's preparedness to, in essence, jump to new parties. So in both Canada and the United Kingdom, first past the post voting systems, we've seen reasonably recently coalition governments. In the same way as in New Zealand, we've had to have coalition governments, because with MMP, unless you've got a crazy election on the back end of a pandemic where people are so grateful they didn't die, they prepared to give a party a majority vote, Labour, 2020. I mean, you're not going to see that again under MMP. Well, put it this way, let's hope we never see that again under MMP because of what caused it. So my point being that the idea of first past the post, that it would deliver one party stable governments based on voters' simple choice of who they like the most, seems to have broken down. And it also runs the risk, as we could see in Britain, of electing a government with a very low cross-nation support, but a majority in Parliament. In fact, that's what Labour got, right? Labour got a massive majority in Parliament with something just north of 30-odd% of the vote. I mean, next election, we could see that swing around, and you could see the same thing with Reform. So first past the post benefit, one-party stable governments, comes at the cost of, if you get it at all, it's with minority support amongst society, which can then leave people feeling very non-reflected in the government. MMP's promise, which is, you'll get parties working together, and you get parties having to form coalitions to govern, everyone, can sort of, see themselves in it. Well, I think what we've seen more and more is you don't know what government you're going to get and what they will do until after the election, when they actually make their deals and then say, hey, congratulations, this is what you elected. So there's no such thing as a perfect voting system. The strengths of first past the post, I think, are starting to fall away. And MMP certainly didn't deliver perhaps what was promised for it at the outset, which was, everyone will have to be nice to each other to govern. I'm not quite sure that we've really seen that.
That's bold, for sure. So I guess in terms of MMP's flaws, what are those at the moment? Like, do we need to think about the threshold we've spoken to, or the length of the parliamentary term? Should we move it up?
I mean, well, the length of the parliamentary term, I think, stands separate to whatever voting system you use. I mean, that's really a question about the policy-making process in Wellington. It's a question about how long it takes for any government, no matter how elected, to really be able to, get its policies in place, have those policies actually start to work so that the voters can then actually judge them, and things like that. Traded off against the fact that in New Zealand, all we have to really hold our governments to account is the ability to vote on them, right? No upper house, no entrenched constitution, Parliament being 100% sovereign and the government having a majority there. All of those things really are why we elect our government so often, because, it's the only chance we have to call them to account. So, that trade-off is separate to how you elect your government. The flaws, in quotation marks, with MMP such as they are, well, there are some questions around the form of representation, the threshold, and so on. There's some question, I think, about, even though MMP was brought in to recognise that political parties are our main way of doing politics, we've strengthened our political parties even further through things like the party hopping law and so on and so on. And also having a parliament of only 120 means that everyone who gets into parliament thinks, oh, one day I could get to cabinet. And therefore everyone's so prepared to, toe the party line. We've sort of lost any sort of independent backbench in New Zealand whatsoever. So that does allow for executive government to dominate parliament in a way that's probably a bit unhealthy. And then there is this issue of, the fact that parties have decided, well, we're really going to leave our governing manifesto and what we will do to the after-election negotiation. And the way in which coalition agreements have now become almost biblical in their form, right? Government justifies everything by, it was in the coalition agreement, therefore it must be done. Where the coalition agreement is not necessarily what voters voted on, right? And so I do think we need to adjust. This is a media thing, it's a voter thing, I think it's a party thing, to say, okay, we want to know up front what sort of things will and won't be in any post-coalition agreement. because otherwise you end up, like I say, you elect your party and then you find out what they're going to do. And that, I think that does have dangerous mandate and democratic sort of legitimacy problems.
And this is probably a silly question, but those coalition agreements, those don't actually have any standing in sort of electoral law, right? That is essentially just a contract, but there's nothing stopping them breaking them. They're not something that was part of the MMP system when it was first created.
They're not even, so they have no legislative backing, right? There's nothing to say that parties must form these agreements in order to govern. B, they're not even a contract. They're, if you were to walk into court and say, Winston Peters was to walk into court and say, I was promised this, and the court will say, no, that's none of our business. They're really, agreements between the parties. This is the basis on which we will. But I think parties have started to, rather than spend 3 years relitigating issues, it's kind of, we will make one agreement at the start, and then we will all agree to treat that as binding on ourselves. Because as soon as you unpick one little bit of it, well, then that sends the message all of it's up for grabs. And, you don't want to be constantly fighting your people you're in coalition with over every single thing you thought you had done and dusted. So, I can see why parties do it. It's just the way they then get talked about as somehow having a direct legitimacy from the voter because the voters chose this. That seems to me to not quite reflect reality.
And when we're talking about the coalition negotiations after the election, those can often take a little bit of time. What can also take a little bit of time is counting the amount of votes. And so to be able to ameliorate some of that, the government of this term has decided that we're going to make some changes to the electoral law and make it so that you can't enroll on election day. You've got to enroll 13 days before. And that is 13 days before. That's October 25th. Make sure you're enrolled by October 25th. So this is positioned, framed to reduce that post-election time frame. Do you have any issues with this?
Yeah, so New Zealand's always had a very easy access to the ballot. We don't have any voter ID. You can just literally walk into any polling station and say, hello, my name is Andrew Geddis. If my name's on the printed electoral roll, so I'm voting in Dunedin and I'm already registered, they just literally cross my name off, give me a ballot paper, and I go and vote. If your name's not on the printed ballot paper, then you have to fill out what's called a special vote declaration, which is literally, a sheet where you put your name, address, and so on and so on. Needs a couple of stamps put on it for official status. And you then get given a ballot and you cast a special vote. And the law was changed so that that special vote form that you filled in would then register you to vote as well. So basically it was a one-stop shop. You could walk in any point during the polling period and vote, and your vote would be valid if you filled out that declaration form properly. What that did do was, it probably made people a bit lazy about registering, to be honest. It was kind of, yeah, you probably should register, but if somehow you haven't got around to it, that's fine. You can just do this instead. And because there were so many special votes started to be cast, in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, as you say, the processing of those and the counting of those takes more time. And so that put a lot of pressure on the Electoral Commission in its processes. It's not really the reason it took so long. There are actually some things written into our Electoral Act and processes written into our Electoral Act that don't involve counting special votes that mean it would have taken as long anyway. But what it did do was it meant that the Electoral Commission was under a lot of strain, and that's why they actually made some mistakes with their counting, because it just was pretty much, it overstrained them. So the government's response to this was twofold. First of all, it's made it easier for people to update their voting status, and also to allow the Electoral Commission to update your voting status for you. So if you shift towns, it used to be you had to physically change your voting where you lived by re-enrolling to vote. There's been a change made, so the Electoral Commission can now do that for you. If they've got proof you've moved houses, they just change which means you're on the voting roll. You don't need to cast a special vote. Now, that in and of itself would probably have helped a lot, because most people who cast special votes aren't people who were never enrolled, they've just moved.
Yeah.
So if you can enroll people for them, you get rid of that problem. But rather than just waiting to see, does that take away enough special votes in order to, take the pressure off, the government also said, and we won't let people enroll to vote while the voting period's on. Now, the problem I have with that personally is that if someone turns up to a polling place and they want to vote, it seems weird to me that we say to them, yeah, well, look, sorry, you didn't fill the form out at the right time. And so your view can't count. That just seems to me to get things around the wrong way. I mean, if people want to vote, we should let them vote, unless there's absolutely some huge reason not to. And administrative convenience, especially when we've introduced other ways to deal with the problem, just don't seem to me to be a good enough reason. And secondly, if people turn up to vote, they're still going to get given a special vote declaration, and they're still going to fill that out, and they're still going to fill out a ballot. It's only when the Electoral Commission then goes to process it and realizes this person isn't registered to vote that we then throw out the vote. So there's going to be a lot of people who think they've cast votes, and the Electoral Commission is going to have to do quite a lot of the work anyway to find out that they weren't allowed to register to vote. So I'm just not sure that the change is going to save as much time as the government thinks it is, whereas we know it's going to have the effect of disenfranchising tens of thousands of people because they didn't fill out a bit of paper at the right point in time. And that to me, I'm not convinced the problem was big enough to require that sort of impact.
This particular change when you can register to vote, and also in the previous government, the changes to the electoral donations were both passed, I understand, by the government. They weren't passed bipartisan, but we do have a history about electoral laws passing bipartisan. Do you think it's a concern that we've had these couple of quite significant changes with both the when you can register to vote and also the electoral donations have been not bipartisan?
There's a little bit of a myth about the bipartisanship of changes to electoral law. I mean, in an ideal world, all our MPs would kind of look at electoral law and they would say, we want to do the best thing for voters, we want to do the best thing, et cetera, et cetera. And so we will try to work together to find what that best thing will be, and then we will all agree to do it. I mean, as soon as you start trying to find the best thing, people start disagreeing, and often disagreeing for, principled reasons, sometimes disagreeing out of self-interest, right? So, I mean, that's a reality. And there are chunks of our electoral law that have changed over time based on that kind of partisan, well, if we can't agree, I'm just going to do my thing anyway because I've got the majority. So Labor, when it introduced the Campaign Finance Act changes in 2008, party line vote. When National disenfranchised prisoners back in 2010, party line vote. So there are a number of examples throughout our electoral law where things have been done this way. I think the point you're reaching for is that if electoral law generally becomes seen as something that whoever's in government can just skew it so that it benefits them, that becomes problematic. Because for one thing, you're going to see tit-for-tat changes. I mean, if Labor, Greens to Party Māori win the next election, they will change back the no enrolling during the voting period. And they will likely change back the no prisoner voting, which the government's put in. So if you see electoral law just, ping-ponging, depending on whomsoever happens to have a majority in a given parliament, well, all of a sudden you start seeing electoral as being a bit like the United States, right? Where, you just gerrymander the hell out of it. You change the rules. Once you're in power, you make the rules so that you make it as hard as possible for the other guys to win. And that then starts to sap trust and confidence in the underlying law that we have. Which is why, a independent electoral review was set up with the hope that we might, give some, but, the reality is that as long as electoral law has its basis in statute, and statute is made by Parliament, which is made on a 62 MPs can do whatever they want basis, there's always going to be that temptation for those 62 plus MPs to go, well, why not get the law I want in this area?
That trust and confidence in the system is something that's quite an interesting thing to think about, because obviously we've got a supreme parliament, but we also have the rule of law.
Yeah.
We've seen, in the both past couple of governments, we've seen them doing things that potentially breach the law, retrospective legislation, passing a lot of things under urgency, which they're very entitled to do, but obviously it's not great lawmaking. How do you sort of see the balance between, Parliament having the sovereign, they are supreme, they can do what they want, but also keeping that rule of law? Like, where does the line slip around what where's too far for a Parliament to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one because, again, with the rule of law and, concepts of, quote, good lawmaking and so on, you're dealing with reasonably slippery concepts that it's hard to find a definition everyone's going to agree, yep, that's exactly what it means, much less agree that's what it means, and this is a situation where it's okay to kind of, go. New Zealand's always worked on what's called the good chap theory of government, and good chap because we're going back to Victorian era where, of course, it was only chaps. So but that people would get into power, and they would have on paper unlimited power. You have 62 MPs in Parliament. On paper, you can do whatever the hell you want. But there's just some things that the good chaps recognise we just ought not to do that. That it's not really the proper done thing. Constitutional conventions, which will be familiar to you as good law students and for other people out there, are essentially rules of practice that are regarded as being binding. You must do this, even though it's not law. That's one example of kind of the good chap theory of government in action. And other things, just, we really shouldn't rush too much legislation through under urgency because it's important that we talk about laws generally, and so on. We really shouldn't legislate over the top of court decisions because, we don't want, people to spend all the time and effort going to court only to have it ultimately ripped out from it. Those sort of ideas were meant to be baked into the idea of what government should do and look like. The worry is, and, we academics always kind of sound like we're kind of, the worry. I mean, but genuinely, the worry is the more that those things are seen as being able to be put to one side because of some more pressing thing, or yes, usually we should do that, but in this situation, well, we'll let it slide. The more that happens, the more their power and the more their ability to constrain in the future slips away. Because, if it looks like everyone else is ignoring these rules, well, you'd be a mug to do it, why should you be the mug who sticks to them when everyone else is ignoring them? So, yeah, I mean, I guess reflecting, a little bit on kind of me and why I do what I do and why sometimes I go out in the media and kind of go, no, outrage. It's to kind of try to remind that, there's a point to why this stuff is done the way it is and why it shouldn't be done the way it's done sometimes. And that if all you do is focus on this one particular narrow issue and just view it, out of that bigger context, the risk is you don't quite understand the damage or the bigger picture harm you might be doing.
I love seeing any article where it says legal expert says blah blah blah, and then scrolling down and seeing your face. It's a fun experience to go to. If you could give a bit of a scorecard on this current government in relation to them abusing or abiding by the checks and balances upon them, what sort of grade are we getting? An A+ this semester, Professor?
Well, I mean, there have been quite a number of reasonably concerning, I think it's fair to say, things have been done. The way in which pay equity was dealt with and the use of the budget process to just race that through before anyone knew what was happening was, I mean, outrageous. I do think there's some concern about seeing how the government's proposing to legislate with regards the tort environmental damage, because it's legislating over an existing court case. I have no problem with Parliament changing the common law. I mean, ACC is Parliament saying you can no longer sue for personal injury.
Mm-hmm.
But when ACC was brought in, they damn well didn't rule out existing claims. So that seems problematic. So my point being, there are quite a number of individual things you can point to. It's always hard when you start then trying to say, is it worse than other people have done? Because, I'm sure we could find lots of examples going back to previous governments of equal, sort of stuff that's happened. I do wonder if the three-headed nature of this current government means that there has been a greater than usual concern for each of those coalition partners to get wins on the board. And I do wonder if that's come a little bit at the expense of what's considered to be good process or, proper ways of doing things. And allied to that, I think, is the fact that, this government has decided to be quite radical in a way that is quite different to the national government of John Key and the Labour governments under Jacinda Ardern and then Chris Hipkins. I mean, I think that Key, even going back to Helen Clark, I think there was kind of a mantra through those governments that change needed to be reasonably slow, reasonably step by step, and it needed to be bedded in because, you needed to basically bring the country with you to get the change happening. This government, I do think, has been prepared to do that, Silicon Valley, move quickly and break things approach. Partly, I think, for, the reason that, I think they genuinely think the country's up shit, creek without a paddle. So, they do think big changes need to happen. I think that's a legitimate point of view. But also, I do think the fact that you've got three parties in there all trying to put their own stamp on things and wanting to be seen to be getting quick wins on particular issues and show that they're making a difference has meant that, advice, minister, maybe you shouldn't really be wanting to do this quite in this way, maybe hasn't landed in quite the way it would have in previous governments.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because it's sort of like at what point do, where's the balance between ultimately we're a democracy. So I think a democracy might not be the most efficient form of government, but it is the fairest.
Sure.
And so it's like, instead, where do politicians draw that line? Do you think that it's something that, it will just continue to slip away as time goes on? Do you just sort of see that?
Yeah, it's sort of hard to know. Crystal ball gazing is tricky. Put it this way, you probably wouldn't want to. I don't think we'd want to carry on down a gradient. You know what I mean? And it's hard to know if we're sort of at a blip period in our sort of politics, and it's not just our politics, right? It is around the world. It's we're not the only ones who perhaps feel that things are fracturing a bit and the system's not quite working in the way it used to, and that old truisms no longer quite work or hold the same value as they did. And the actions and points of view of other jurisdictions inevitably flow through. Like, I do think Trumpism and Trumpist politics has impacted a bit about how people think politics looks here, and what's considered to be effective and what's considered to work in a way I don't think is particularly healthy. Social media has got a lot to blame for. It does all put us in our own little, bubbles where we tend to only hear from the same folk, and that drives kind of divisiveness and stuff in society. But will that then inevitably mean that, our course is set and we have to go down? That I feel less confident in. If we were to go back to, 2020, January of 2020, our view of how the world was going to be all of a sudden just boom disappeared once COVID hit, and everything became different. Who knows what the equivalent of politics COVID is? So I guess I'm reluctant to try to speculate too much about where we will end up. I'd prefer to say, hey, we perhaps should be aware of certain developments and the direction in which we're heading, and if this becomes the standard way of doing things, what might that deliver us, and do we really want that? That seems to me as much as we can do.
You touched there on the role of social media in modern day politics and how it can lead to more divisiveness because we're in our echo chambers, in our bubbles. What role do you think social media plays in politics? And then I guess a double whammy, second question, what role is AI playing in politics, and are we prepared?
Yeah. I think the first thing social media is, two things social media has done. First of all, it has exacerbated the division of the electorate into smaller and smaller bits. And the second thing it's done is it's allowed politicians to more immediately access those smaller and smaller bits. Then once you start to build in algorithmic advertising and so on, targeting messages in ways that, impact or work for one group and the other group doesn't have to see it. All of that stuff, I think, has been a net negative, to be honest, in terms of how our public discourse go. The other thing that social media has done is it's stripped out the funding for media, like the old legacy media. And I think that's had a really negative impact in the legacy media, the old school TV news, newspapers, and so on, their ability to actually form some sort of, quality information source for society. I think that's really worrying. A world in which everyone gets their point of view from whatever internet source of news they prefer or have pumped to them, with no way to really tell what's quality versus not quality. That strikes me as an absolute recipe for disaster. There's H.L. Mencken, who was a old school American journalist, had a saying which is, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your truth, which strikes me as, if we ever lose sight of that, if everyone just starts dealing in their own truths, which they then build their opinions on, and we don't actually have some sort of common agreed, okay, this is the way things are, now let's argue about how to see them, then it's going to be very difficult, I think, to actually form, the sort of collective agreements that we need for politics to work. AI then comes in over the top, and AI strikes me as a looming cluster on the shambles, because A, we've no idea what it's going to do. B, what it's going to do is in the hands of some people who frankly scare the shit out of me. And 3, it's not just what it's going to do in terms of social media and being able to produce incredibly lifelike, realistic, this is something you must it's not that. It's what it's going to do to the workforce and people's futures. And, the last thing we want to see is a lot of people finding they don't really have a place in the work world anymore because AI is, being seen to take away their necessary job in an environment where social media is splitting us up and is feeding our resentments, et cetera, et cetera. That just strikes me as a recipe for society to really fall apart. And the fact that it's all happening without any of us really seeming to be able to do anything about it, because the data centers just keep getting built and models just keep getting made, and it just gets put into everything we do on the internet, and every program you open says, hey, AI is good. I didn't sign up for that. And it just seems weird to me that essentially our society is going to change out of sight with no collective governance of it in any way, shape, or form.
Do you think that you probably answered this question, but do you think that our electoral law and then more broadly our law is keeping up with what social media and AI is, how it's changing things, or do you think it can keep up?
Well, I mean, the big problem at the moment is there's no requirement to label or say something is AI. And I think something like that will need to get put in. I mean, at the moment we've got, if you put out a political ad, you've got to put your name and address on it. That's great for sort of, insofar as we can, being able to link someone back to the ad. But as AI starts to create images and starts to create truthiness and so on, I do think there needs to be some requirement to stamp it as, this is not real.
Yeah, and I think you've segued quite nicely into another line of questioning I wanted to ask, and that's about electoral advertising. So we've got 3 months before the election, a regulated period. What can we expect during that period, and why do we have rules in place about advertising and spending?
Sure. So at all points in time, the requirement when it comes to electoral advertising is you've got to put your name and address on it. So if you put up a Facebook ad, if you put a leaflet through someone's letterbox, if you put a billboard up on it, whatever it is, doesn't matter what medium it's in, if it's an electoral ad, it's got to have your name and address on it. And the idea of that is that people can at least see who's behind the ad. You can get some idea of who's trying to put this message to you. Once we get within 3 months of election day, there are then extra rules kick in around election spending. And the idea of that is to create, insofar as is possible, given, people's wildly different access to money, some sort of even playing field when it comes to being able to put messages out to the world. So political parties, candidates, and what are called promoters, that's people who are publishing election ads, all face spending caps within that 3-month period. And so really what that then requires of, political parties and candidates, they have to start totaling up how much they're spending on their advertising. People who aren't political parties and candidates, you can still spend quite a bit of money. I think it's about up to $16,000 now, putting out election advertising, and all you have to do is put your name and address on it. No extra rules. But if you want to spend more than $16,000, you're a big nationwide pressure group, or you happen to have a lot of money and just want to spend it on something, you need to register with the Electoral Commission. And once you register with the Electoral Commission, you can then spend up to, I think it's about $400,000 on that sort of advertising. So within the 3 months, in essence, the idea is you're getting so close to the election that spending lots and lots of money might actually start to impact people, because people are starting to think about politics at that point. Now, not so much,
Just the words, right?
Yeah. So if someone wants to drop $1 million on election advertising now, the feeling is, well, go for it if you want, but it's not likely to work. Drop $1 million on election advertising a month out from the election, all of a sudden looks like you might be going to do something. So the spending cap tries to capture that period of time, which is considered to be, most relevant to the campaign.
And you've touched on, specific groups or people who have a lot of money and can spend a lot of money being able to do so for their political party of their choice. Personally, I feel a little bit iffy about political donations at the moment where we're at, because I think some people have a lot more money and then they just get to further entrench their views and what they want. Do you think our system around political donations needs to have a look at?
Well, again, the independent electoral review that I was part of made a bunch of proposals on this. One of which was, we said there should be a $30,000 cap on individuals being able to donate to a party or its associated candidates. So you can give up to $30,000 to the Labour Party and all the individual Labour Party candidates as one pot. And the idea of that was, in essence, to try to break any hold that big donors may have over a particular political party, and to also just stop any suspicion that big, that sort of hold might exist. The issue with that is that if you do put that $30,000 cap, some parties are going to start getting a whole lot less money, because National Labour, the ACT Party, a fair chunk of their income is through amounts over that $30,000. The question then is, if you're going to be taking that income from parties, do you need to replace it with something? And our proposal was, yep, we recognise that that's a risk, and so you might need to give state funding to parties, which then becomes a political hot potato, because you have to go to voters and say to voters, political parties need your tax dollars to do their job, to properly represent and allow democracy to work. It's a hard ask.
On that though, do you think that in New Zealand, because then obviously America, there's massive big perceptions and issues around people buying policies and stuff. Do you think we actually have that issue in New Zealand? Or do you think it's just a bit of a perception?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I short answer is I don't know of any recent polling. It would be interesting to see. I mean, it's a sort of I mean, it's one of those things that's just sort of an assumed truth that, if there's a lot of money flowing to political parties from a very few number of people giving large amounts of money, that will undermine trust in democracy. I mean, that's just expressed as being a truism. You're right. There's no reason that it should be seen as a truism. It's an empirical question. And so we probably, before doing what we recommended, you'd really want to go out and test the presumptions. And that, I think, requires a fair bit of opinion polling and et cetera. Yeah, because you're right. I mean, it may well be that people just sort of go, yes, okay, so someone's got $200,000. They want to give it to Labour. Labour's going to do what Labour does. They're not going to be bought for 200,000 grand. So if you want to use your money that way, go for it. I'd buy a yacht personally, but do what different people do, right? Yeah. So my point being, I don't know what the quote ordinary Kiwi in the street would see, whether they'd see that as being, that's terrible, Labour's been bribed, or they go, well, no, it's their money. If they want to do it, I don't have a problem. I just literally don't know.
In terms of that sort of voters' perception and that voters' mentality, how do you think we can sort of boost voters' understanding and their trust and confidence in our institutions? Is it more education? Should we all be going to Otago University?
Now, what I reckon is we should have a compulsory 3-yearly citizenship test, which says, unless you get 75% of these questions right, we're going to revoke your citizenship. Hang on. I mean, so the kind of the liberal holy grail of this is, quote, civics education, right?
Yeah.
We need to tell the kids, we need to tell. It seems to me that schools have it so tough because every time there's a problem, it's kind of, we should teach the kids and the schools will fix it, right? And also, I mean, in the US, they have compulsory civics classes. And I'm not sure the US has got much better knowledge of how their system works and so on. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with learning civics in schools. I just don't know that it's going to be the golden panacea that we see it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it seems to me people get interested in stuff that they feel, A, matters to them, and B, they think they can do something about.
Mm.
And so asking how we get people interested in politics so they get involved maybe actually gets things around the wrong way. People need to see a reason to get involved with politics, to learn about it and understand it. What then gets involved with politics, etc.? I mean, that seems to me that's on the parties, right? I mean, it really does seem to me that any sort of view of the electorate as being things you engage with every 3 years to get their vote so you can carry on doing what you're doing is always going to undermine a engaged and understanding electorate. Stuff that's going to get people really involved in understanding is things like the Treaty Principle Bill, where all of a sudden, people were like literally sitting up all night to learn how to write a submission to select committee, or things like that. So, parties need to find ways to say to the public, hey, get involved with this because it really matters. And by doing that, you're going to learn it. We're not going to formally educate you in how the system works, because if you try to sit down and formally educate folk, they just switch off. But by doing this, you just will learn.
I don't know if we switched off in your lectures, did we?
Yeah, you're not normal.
No, I'd probably agree that we've spent hours talking about electoral law.
Yeah. I mean, it's if you were doing a podcast on, I don't know, Great Danes, and we were sitting here, why don't more people love Great Danes? We love Great Danes, right? We tend to think the stuff we really care about and think's important. Yeah. Well, it must be, otherwise I wouldn't care about it, right? So
yeah, I agree. So I guess kind of leading off from that, and perhaps one of our final questions, what is one thing that you would like voters to consider before November 7th?
Yeah. Honestly, vote for the party, not the person who's leading the party. I do think that the personalization and presidentialization of our politics, where parties become tied up with the personality of their leader, and people then use that as a shortcut for assessing what the party is and so on. I wish people could see past that and to recognize that, so the party leader, they're the leader, but they're only one of probably 40 or so folk who will be in Parliament. So, don't vote National based on whether you like Chris Luxon or not. Vote National on what National says it's going to do and what its policies are and what it wants for the country. Same for Labour, same for the Greens. And don't get, I like the look of them, so I'll vote for them. That just strikes me as the worst way of voting.
But very quickly, what if that party is very centred around that one person?
Yes, well, I think all we know who we're talking about. So then you assess the party on that basis. Yeah, I mean, I do think, I'm going to lay down the Geddis rule, which is, for every thing about New Zealand politics, there's a Winston Peters exception. And I mean, that's yeah.
I think it's a good note to leave it on.
That's perfect. It always ends back at Winston Peters, doesn't it? Thank you so much, Professor Andrew Geddis. It was a pleasure to catch up with you once again, and thank you so much for your time.
Yep, lovely chatting. Take care.